Well, greetings everyone. Welcome back to the second session of the three on this particular topic on Christian cultural heritage. We are continuing to look at the Western aspect of religion. We last time looked at definitions for religion, some of the background to the term religion and how it's used. And now we're going to move in to how people explain away the idea of religion as something that comes from God. And then we'll take a look at the perspective of God revealing himself to us, and that is what's constituted religion. So we'll be looking at those today in this video, and we'll continue it in the third video for this week. And so it's our third week in this course, and hopefully you're keeping up with the work, and we'll be talking online. So let me share the screen with you, and we'll get to the video. All right. After having talked about the definition of religion, and we showed which definition we're going to use, we're now going to look at three different approaches to understanding religion. And these are the subjective, or sometimes called the psychological approach, the evolutionary approach, and then the one that we're going to follow in this course, the monotheism as the source of religion. And so we're going to look at each one of these. In this particular video, we'll be looking at the first one and get into the second one, and then we'll finish out with the last video, finishing out the evolutionary, and then on into monotheism. So well, that's where we're heading with all of this. All right, so let's talk about this the subjective theory. In this theory, religion is thought to just be based on subjective, subconscious feelings that are given physical expression. Now, we have to remember that we've seen that humans are notoriously religious. Every culture, every nation has always been highly religious. And so you have to come up with some explanation why this exists. Now, as Christians, we know this exists because God created us in his image, and he's made us spiritual beings. So we seek that aspect. But for those who may not consider that, they still have to come up with, okay, I don't believe in religion, I don't believe in God, or I really doubt he exists. Yeah, they still have to deal with the subject matter, because so many people are religious and continue to be religious. So one of them is to come up with a subjective theory. And so they say basically we invent religion out of our minds. So they would say it developed to fulfill the needs of men, or people, it would be better said, so whatever we feel that religion can fulfill, so we create religion. So religion is a part of humanity, and where it comes from is not that important, other than the fact that it's something we invent from this perspective. Specific beliefs and practices then are expressions of subconscious symbols and attitudes. So they're not, the beliefs and practices are not something we receive from God. It's something that's expressed because of some subconscious events. Divine revelation is not really from God, but a product of people's expression of their psychics, they would say. And then rituals that come out, that are you see practiced in various religions, they say these are just outlets for some subconscious religious drives. So for them, as the picture shows there up here, it's basically invented in our minds, this idea of religion. So in this psychological subjective over here, you got God and spirit, it's all in the mind. Where for the monotheistic approaches, God exists, he's communicated to humanity, and humanity can communicate back. There's this relationship. And we'll get into that more as we go along. Contributors to this theory, we mentioned Mr. Schleiermacher earlier, and you know, the idea that you know, God, begins with a feeling of dependence, not a set of beliefs. It's dependence on an absolute, which he would say is God. So it proceeds from a feeling of dependence to the idea that an object of dependence exists. Not that necessarily there is a God. And so again, gets back to those subjective feelings and this feeling of dependence for him. Ludwig Feuerbach, concept of God as being with idealized human traits taken to their ultimate characteristics. So he says, we've come up with God because we just idealize human traits to make this ideal human being that's above us. So worshiping God is worshiping the ideal self-image, is what he would say, and in his essence of Christianity. And so again, we're inventing God is the basic idea here. Yeah. And then Sigmund Freud, who we mentioned earlier, almost everybody knows his name. He viewed it, God, as a psychological need for a father figure. And so God isn't actually God, but we've invented him by our neurotic need for a father figure. And so, they may have an imperfect father, but so they've idealized this perfect father figure. And so he says religious nature is a symptom of psychological immaturity. So, we make up God in our mind, and it's because we're so psychologically immature in his opinion. And today, some people, that's what they would say for people who are believers, that they have to have some kind of psychological crutch, and so it continues to be something that people think about. Rudolf Otto, he published the book The Idea of the Holy in 1917. He says a person is overwhelmed with a feeling of God's greatness and majesty and one's own limitations, a feeling of fear and awe. And so he's basically saying this is a psychological experience from subconscious, non-rational faculties. And this is one of the things you'll see in common with most of these. It's a feeling, it's an experience, it's a subconscious, non-rational mental experience. And so they all kind of have that aspect in mind. And of course, we know that God created us as rational beings, and you need reason to look at his revelation to think about God. And so just putting it into a non-rational category, it doesn't really fit with what's the reality is. Well, you have some ones that go into the 20th century. You got C.J. Jung. He expressed human dreams from the subconscious are expressed in religion, is his perspective of it. Mircea Eliade from the University of Chicago, subconscious symbols manifest themselves in manifestations of the holy. So again, it's subconscious symbols, dreams or whatever. There continues to be this subjective theory for explaining how religion it comes into existence. There's a lot of problems with this view, but it is a popular view, and you will run into it. But if you don't believe that there is a God and you have to explain religion somehow, and to be fair with the fact that so many people are religious. But if you take this perspective, God is just a manifestation of our human condition. Whatever psychological things are going on, that's what's somehow, depending on which view you want to follow, is what's creating it, or just lump them all together. Even if the subjective exists, it does not rule out that God as reality apart from humanity. We are created in God's image, the Bible tells us, but that doesn't mean God comes out of our own imagination. God is self-existing, separate from humanity. But in creating us in His image, he may well have given humanity a sense of dependence, a feeling of the other, or the idea of the holy, taking some of these guys' words, because in creating us as both physical and human beings, as we talked about earlier, that open worldview, we would expect that we would have this sense about us, and that's why humans are just notoriously religious. Well, we can suppress it, but the feeling is still there. That, and then we look at the biblical revelation or the world around us, nature, and we may say, well, how could this be with, there's got to be a creator, there's got to be intelligence behind it, and so we can use our reason, and it's not just some kind of vague subconscious thing. So these views start from self-experience, not from God revealing Himself or revelation. The question is, did a sense of God begin with humans or with God? And of course, as Christians, and in this course, we'll be taking the perspective that it began with God. But at the same time, we realize as humans, we have these experiences and senses as well. Now, that's the subjective and psychological approach. Now, there's another one that's the evolutionary approach, which really, in essence, they kind of put these together. I've separated them out, but there is some distinctives with the evolutionary approach. But generally, if someone takes the evolutionary approach, they throw in a lot of the psychological as part, because as humans evolve and they change their view of religion, that's because they're progressing from the primitive animal-like being that evolutionary theory puts forward to a more complex human being. So their mental capacities change, and that changes their view of religion. And so, but we're going to separate them out. So we're going to just look and kind of give you the basis for the evolutionary approach. And of course, everybody thinks of the Charles Darwin as the founder of evolutionary theory. But there was already, before Darwin came along, there was already the idea of the world moving from primitive to more complex. Darwin just gave it a more scientific setting. So he kind of becomes the starting point for it. But the idea, the philosophical idea was already there, that humanity was progressing from primitive to being better and better all the time. Of course, this didn't really turn out to be true. By the 20th century, you had World War I in the early 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, you had World War II, and you've had multiple wars. And so the idea that humanity is progressing isn't really a strong thing these days, even though there is still a commitment in some scientific circles to evolutionary theory, which has a lot of big holes in it. But the idea here is that we're going to look at this from the perspective that this is how they see, they use that same kind of idea to explain religion. So primitive cultures indicate the earlier stages. This came up in cultural anthropology. They said they went and studied very, quote, primitive tribes, and they said, well, we should be able to find in them the early stages of religion. And so the early anthropologists would go out and find these different tribal groups and say they represent the earliest forms of religion. Of course, that's pretty prideful position to take, because you're assuming your Western culture is the highest known form. Well, you can go to some of these tribal groups, like my wife and I did when we were missionaries in Kenya, and they had traditional African religion, which would have been considered rather primitive. However, it has a lot of connections to monotheism, which they consider the higher part of religion, and they were monotheistic. So we'll see later that this approach really doesn't hold any water. Animistic theory is a part of this. Edward Burnett Tyler, in a couple volumes, Primitive Culture, he maintained that primitive people developed a sense of other or soul from experience with death and dreams. So notice, again, it's experience. So notice you getting the psychological approach in here too. Primitive people believe that these souls, in Latin they're called anima, were to be found not only in people, but in all nature, stones, trees, animals, rivers, springs, volcanoes, so forth. This is where we get our term animism, which we'll talk about more later. Another concept for these primitive religious thinking people, R.H. Condrington, he was a missionary. He noted the idea of mana, not to be confused with man, with what the the Israelites got in the wilderness, manna. These were supernatural powers that belong to the region of the unseen. He had done some studies in Melanesia and come across this. This mana power, the spiritual power, can do both good and evil. So for him, mana was that invisible power which is believed by, as he would say, the natives, to cause all such effects as transcends their conceptual of the regular course of nature and resides in spiritual beings. And so this mana is some sort of vague spiritual power. We'll be coming back to these a little bit later. Max Mueller, Oxford professor, he formed a lot of his ideas from studying the mythology in India. Believed religion developed from observance of forces of nature, which they saw the regularity of the seasons, the tides, the phases of the moon. So, as he said it, primitive people identified the forces in nature, personified them, created myths to describe their activities, and eventually developed a pantheon and religions around those. And so that was his view of development. And then Sir James George Fraser, he wrote a series of books called The Golden Bow. Though he looks at development of religion going through three phases. And he would say there's magic. This is the attempt to control the world of nature through magic, if not coerced by magic. And from there you get magic, which is basically magic in the sense of trying to control spiritual things going on in the world. To religion, this is a higher form, he would say. Nature can be implored to cooperate in his view of religion. And then he would say the next step up would be science, the rational understanding of nature was his perspective of it. So again, you're seeing some evolutionary thinking in Fraser's writings. So what you get then is kind of this, I've made this pyramid here to kind of give you the idea of what we're talking about here. At the bottom, you got the most primitive is this mana or fetishism. We'll talk about what fetishism is. And then the animism we talked about is the next stage. And then polytheism, the next stage. And then enotheism. You may not recognize this word. We'll define them. And then monotheism there. And then at the top, what comes if man's evolving and in this religion, what comes after monotheism? The majority of the world are monotheistic, and if you just combine Christianity and Islam, it's the two largest religions. That's over half the world, and you can add in some others. A lot of African traditional are monotheistic, and Judaism is so. But if it's evolving, where does it go next? Well, so we'll look at each one of these stages and kind of expound a little bit further on what these guys said, but we're going to be looking at the concept of each one, the mana or fetishism. And mana came from the word in Melanesian cultures, describing some general awareness of a spiritual force around them in nature and their lives and so forth. It's a non-personal force, and it doesn't really reveal itself. So there's no interpersonal, but it can affect you positively or negatively. This force pervades the physical realm, but unevenly distributed. Some areas have more of the mana than other places do, and some places are known to be, filled with the mana, or at least thought to be. And but you always want to have positive contact with it, so it doesn't harm you, because the negative side of mana can hurt you. So it can cause you problems in life. So one seeks to have positive relationships, and that's why some of these cultures they have shamans and witch doctors, so forth, that help you to keep that positive relationship, or if it seems to go bad, they can tell you what to do about it, that type of thing. All right, well, fetish, on the other hand, it's not, someone who, likes shoes or something like that, inordinate amount, but it's an object that's seen to be endowed with a great amount of mana. And you can see this in voodooism, where probably the most famous thing you see is somebody makes a voodoo doll. They stick a pin in the person that represents that person, and that person over there gets a pain from the pin being stuck in him. But it can be any kind of object can be endowed with this power, and so. That's what a fetish is. So it's just mana, the idea of spiritual power within some kind of physical object, and the idea is humans need to harness this mana for positive effects. This is where it gives rise to magic. It's not like magic and the ones you see on TV, David Copperfield, or who's some of the others, I don't remember, but this is where they manipulate, where humans manipulate the spiritual forces so they can get their desired results. So a good example of this, if you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies, where of course he's an apprentice that's beginning to learn how to be a magician, sorcerer, and of course there's spiritual power out there, but they have to utilize it. They do that through spells, through potions, things. And but if you do it wrong, it may have bad results. You might want to, make some kind of elixir, but instead of doing what you want to do, it turns somebody into a frog or something. And you can see that in the movie, that sometimes their incantations go wrong and so forth. So you have to have the correct technique for that to be successful. And of course, the good magicians are the ones that have the best technique. So Harry Potter, he becomes one of the kings of, magicians. And even in modern religion, sometimes we can approach the spiritual aspect of life in a way that's more like trying to manipulate the spiritual forces. But this is at the bottom of that evolutionary scale, that in this theory of evolutionary theory of religion. Here's a picture of taken where we worked in Kenya. This was a medicine man. One of my coworkers, we were studying the culture as we learned the language, and we're going to begin doing mission work there. And so you wanted to learn about, what did people believe, what did they think about different things, and one of his job was to talk to medicine man and find out what that all meant. And this falls in under the area of animism. He would help people through his potions and things to deal with the ancestral spirits or evil spirits and so forth, so on. And this guy, a very pleasant fellow, but you can see he had a horn there, and he called out, and he has potion medicines in there, and then he carries a bag around with him with all kinds of other stuff with him. And but he's an example of this. So in animism, there's this belief in the worship of spiritual beings that inhabit people, places, and objects. And these can take the form of nature spirits. They generally have human form and personality, but not directly related to humanity. They inhabit places, objects, and animals. They may speak and have a kind of social order depending on the belief system of the culture. The other, which is probably a little more prevalent, is ancestral spirits. This is the way it was where we were in Africa. Departed family members that may interact with the living relatives, generally for protection of the family or clan, unless you offend them. I mean, you don't want to upset them. And in some cultures, ancestors are highly venerated, like in China and Japan. Usually influential, as long as you remember, you're remembered by the living person. And so you have to realize that sometimes you may do something that you think, these bad things are happening to me because I've offended one of my ancestral spirits. And so you would call the medicine man or a witch doctor and try to find out what you can do to change that situation. And so animism is a part of a number of belief systems, but it's even, in modern times, there's people that have strong belief in it. To complete this section, we're going to stop after this slide. We'll continue to talk about animism here. First of all, these spirits, they're limited in power. They need to be informed, not to be surprised. For example, when I was out in a village one day and it got dark, I was going to head back to my car, going down the path from down a mountain to where I'd parked the car. And an old man came up to me and said in Khmer, he goes, "Well, don't go down this path because the spirits are there. Go down this way. You don't want to surprise them." And I wasn't worried about the spirits, but to respect his concern, I went a different way. But that idea exists there, and sometimes we don't realize how much these views impact a culture. But for example, in where we were, they traditionally had only round huts, and that's because the corners, if they were squared, they have dark areas because there's no electricity, and that's where the spirits would lurk, and you didn't want to have that available. So their existence, if you ask, well, how do they live in this spiritual place, they would describe it much like their physical realm, except it's spiritual. So they would say, yeah, they have huts and they go farming and do things like that. But they can do more than people because they're spiritual beings, but yet they're still limited. They can be assistants to humans. They can provide insight to life's direction for success. Fortune tellers, say, and soothsayers, diviners, they'll say, hey, I can find out this information for you. And they can even provide you protection from your enemies because they're ancestors of your family or clan. You should have a respect for spirits. They say you want to keep in harmony with your family and the community and honor your ancestors. So that's why in some cultures you'll see these altars to the ancestors, and they even modern day they'll have pictures up there and things like that. And so they want to keep this harmony, and because if you don't and you don't respect your ancestors, they can cause you problems. To control them and to do that, I mentioned the medicine men, witch doctors, or shamans. They are trained and they have the means to gain the cooperation of the spirits or to control them with various magic. And this varies tremendously between cultures, how they do all this. And so from culture to culture, you just see what kind of ways they deal with this kind of animism. And so that's getting into animism. We're going to move from animism into the next one, polytheism, next time. So until then, I hope you're keeping up, and look forward to talking to you online. So take care and see you at the next lecture.